Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello and welcome to the 21st module in the series Marketing Management, a VUCA perspective. We are discussing fundamentals, and I am your friend and your tour guide, Siddhi Bhattacharya. Now, in the words of William Edwards Deming, somebody who is a renowned composer, a renowned economist, somebody who understands marketing and strategy very, very deeply and very, very well, he has actually gone ahead and said something very, very important about data points. Without data, you're just another person with an opinion. So, data actually helps us substantiate whatever we have tried to figure out in terms of any hunches, in terms of any gut feelings, in terms of any exploratory research that we've come up with. Data really is that one particular underscore which gives us measure, which gives us an understanding of how things are, what particular potency they have, and what we can do with it when it comes to generalizing it with the audience as such. So, therefore, we've discussed qualitative marketing research in the previous module. Here, we now step into the more numbers led aspect, the more conclusive part of market research, which is quantitative research. You get definitive answers from quantitative research, and you move from probing, which is more exploratory in the qualitative space, to a more data led approach here. And quantitative research is aimed at finding precision with data based identification of answers that cover the entire gamut of consumer responses. So, without further ado, we will move into the 21st module, the major investigation type being quantitative research. Now, when we look at quantitative research, it is conclusive. It is something which gives us true answers which we can then extrapolate on a sample and thereafter on the large target audience population. Conclusive research designs can either be causal, which means they have a cause and an effect, or descriptive, so that they describe a certain process of how to reach to a final end point or end game. The primary goal of descriptive research is to describe something, and it is often related to market characteristics or functions, and survey methods can vary here depending on how they are conducted, including typical traditional phone interviews, or nowadays you've got computer assisted phone interviews. You can have completely automated phone interviews. You have at times in-home interviews where your surveyor comes home, they ask you a set of questions, they fill out a form, you probably fill out the form partly yourself. Then there are mall intercepts where people accost you in the malls and they ask you a certain few questions. They could be computer assisted personal interviews, maybe on a web page. You can be sent certain surveys over your mail, whether it be electronic or whether it be postal. And then you've got mail panels as well, in which a lot of various inputs can come from your side. You can have online surveys which are form based as well. A variety of such survey methods exist. And beyond this, there are other forms of conclusive research also we find, and these could be experimental and causal research as well. In measurement and scaling, we explore various formats that exist, which are popular and are being taken up by market researchers, marketing teams and such. And we take a look at statistical modeling to cover maximum ground of what all can be done. So we dive straight into quantitative research as a space and appreciate the major descriptive research formats that exist and are popular with the particular marketing research and marketing teams. Again, we head back to the market research design format, where we've taken various inputs from in our previous conversations. You've defined the problem, you've developed your approach to the problem, you've actually gone ahead and done the qualitative research and understood certain nuances. You have probably derived certain hypotheses which you now want to test out there in the market for their veracity and how it plays out when it comes to the entire context of the sample size and the larger population. Here we get into the surveys and observation research, and then thereafter in experimental research and measurement and scaling. So these three aspects together, they create the entire quantitative research aspect of things. So here is a master outlay of all sorts of descriptive research, typically quantitative in nature. So within the entire larger construct of quantitative descriptive research, you have survey types and then you have observational types of researches. In surveys, typically the information is obtained by questioning the respondents. So a surveyor may either pass the form out or they may sit and ask questions to which the respondents then give their answers. And in the case of observations, the surveyor typically observes certain phenomena without interacting with the people who are involved in that particular phenomena, and they just make records. Later, in either case, once the inputs come in, the inputs are then tabulated across the entire observation set, and then they are actually looked at for their generalization aspects when it comes to the larger population size. When you have a survey method, what you typically do is you put out a set of questions for the respondents to answer. And these are in the form of a prepared structured questionnaire. That structured questionnaire is generally driven by all the hypotheses you have derived in your previous understanding, from getting secondary data inputs, your one source data inputs, to even having certain hypotheses crafted from qualitative research you may have gotten into prior to this. Then this particular questionnaire is administered to the respondents and the responses are therefore tabulated once the response is completed across the entire sample set. In terms of survey methods, there are broadly 4 types of survey methods we can look at. One is the telephone, one is the personal, one is the mail based, and then one is the electronic. In the telephone format, it is fairly simple. You have a typical traditional telephone survey where a caller asks a certain set of questions of you, and if today's date is seen, you can actually see computer assisted telephone interviewing called CAT-I, which is typically administered over an IVR or intelligent voice response system. In the case of personal interviews, people generally come home, they book your time, they sit you down. Similar things happen at a shorter notice in malls, which are called mall intercepts. And you have mechanized ways of doing this by computer. So computer assisted personal interviewing or CAP-I is something which also exists. This typically is done on a screen where you are able to respond to the stimuli on the screen. In mail, you may get mail or faxed interviews that come at you. You are supposed to fill them out and send them back. And you may also subscribe to be part of a mail panel. In the case of electronic response, you will typically get emails which you can respond to. They open up on a landing page, and at times you may have direct surveys straight out of the internet, again, which will typically be on a web page where you will have questions, very pointed ones, not very descriptive ones, and you can answer these. And these responses are then brought back and tabulated by the market research organization. In case of the entire advantages and disadvantages, if we look at each of these aspects, when we look at telephone based surveys, you can see they are fast, quickly executed, very easily done. They have a high sample control, and the field force which is executing it, they have a good control of the entire scenario. A response rate is generally very all right with this, because typically when people answer the phone and they are asked to, and willingly they agree to answer the survey, they generally answer it through and through. And this is all done at a moderate cost. You can't therefore put out physical stimuli except for the conversation which the field personnel is having with the respondent. You are limited to simple questions. Why? Because the more number of questions you ask, a sort of fatigue tends to build in into the entire exercise, which must be guarded against. And the quantity of data, therefore, you can garner from this is reservedly low. In home interviews are obviously far more detailed and complex. So the questions also can be fairly complex. You can expose the respondent to physical stimuli, things they can touch, see, smell, things they can hear, things they can even taste. And you've got excellent sample control in this particular scenario. The quantity of data which can be captured because you've taken up time with that particular individual is fairly high, and the response rate is also seen to be quite all right. The control of the field force is limited because you never know where they will be, how long they will take in a particular interview. So then the control of the field force is limited, and this has high social desirability. So therefore, it is something which requires people to spend that kind of time and their openness to be part of that particular kind of engagement. And it has a potential for injecting the interviewer's personal biases into the conversation as well. It is the most expensive form of descriptive research we can see, and it definitely takes quite long to conclude. In mail intercepts, complex questions definitely can be asked. It is very good for physical stimuli because you may send sachets or samples, etc., swatches. It is very good control of the environment because the consumer can fill and send back as they require, and it has a decent response rate as well. It again has high social desirability, so hence you need that to come to play. And again, there is potential for interviewer bias here. The quantity of data which you can receive from the respondent is moderate here, and it also does have a high cost embedded. In CAPI, you can ask complex questions for sure. Good physical stimuli exposure can be input, and you have very good control of the environment because it's all machine led, and you have an excellent response rate and very low potential for interviewer bias because it is all structured through a machine algorithm. Again, high social desirability is seen. Quantity of data is moderate, and the cost is high because the machines, the software, the programming, etc., they cost you, and the deployment as well. In mail, you can't have any field force, so there is no problem as well, and there is zero interviewer bias as well. You have moderate to high quantity of data which you can bring in, and there is no social desirability, so it's easy to execute as well. But the questions, therefore, become very simple. And the sample control for cold mail, because people tend to at times not look at samples and surveys. So that is again something which goes through the roof. You don't have any control of the environment. How are they responding? Are they taking input from somebody else or fully filling it by themselves? You never know. And the rate response for cold mail is very low. So again, you may or may not have a sufficient sample size filling it out and sending it back to you. In terms of mail panel, you have no field force problems because it's very similar to the other one. No interviewer bias, low to moderate cost, high quantity of data, good sample control, and low social desirability. But again, limited to simple questions, low to moderate speed, and again, no control over the environment for sure. In terms of email, it is extremely low cost because just an email going out. There is no interviewer bias. It's got high speed, low social desirability, and you can contact hard to reach people otherwise who you can't get a hold of. And these respondents may come online and respond. The quantity of data you can get is moderate. There is very low sample control you can get out of this. No control of the environment because again, it's similar to mail. Low response rate because people at times skip the emails coming to them for service. And there could be certain email security concerns because it is hackable. Well, it is hackable to the extent that your security or your email provider provides it to you. And in terms of the internet service that can run, these can be made visually interesting and interactive. And there is no interviewer bias. It has low cost because you're running it on a constant web page with a database fixed behind it. Low social desirability makes it very, very easy for people to fill in. Very high speed because it's just fill it, shut it, forget it. Personalized, flexible questioning given various tags can be input here. So, in case you choose a particular option amongst a multiple choice, you can be taken down different trails of questions basis that one particular prompt, and again you can reach hard to reach respondents here. The quantity of data is moderate, low sample control, no control of the environment where people are filling in, and people also may skip this, so there is low response rate as well. So broadly this gives you a mix of the advantages vis-a-vis the disadvantages of various kinds of descriptive research. There are other descriptive research formats which exist, and so therefore we must look at those as well. Here there are completely automated telephone surveys which are IVR based, like we spoke of. These share the advantages and disadvantages of cat-eye and can be useful for short inbound surveys initiated by the respondent because they may do this on demand. The wireless phone interview format, which is voice based, can also be done. It's similar to CAT-S and shares its advantages and disadvantages, and it is useful for point of purchase surveys if respondents is willing. You have to have the respondent willing for this, but they come in handy. Now, wireless phone interviews, which are text based, they share the advantages and disadvantages of emailer interviews, but these tend to be much shorter, lesser number of questions, more point of fact, and again point of purchase interactions can be done if the respondent is willing. Then you've got in-office interviews where you catch people at their workplace. It has the advantages and disadvantages of the in-home interview, just the setting is different, and useful for interviewing busy managers who you can't get a hold of otherwise. Then there are central location interviews where you have a venue where you invite people to come in. This has the advantages and disadvantages of mail intercepts. Places where it comes into play are trade shows, conferences, exhibitions, purchase intercepts, etc. And this again points to a captive audience kind of scenario. Typically in events and conferences, seminars, etc., where people are already there. And if you run these surveys there, then there are chances that people just might fall into the kitty. Now, there are kiosk-based computer interviewing, which are typically similar to the CAPI system. Again, various organizations do this on a regular basis. You can see more details here. Fax interviews share the advantages and disadvantages of mail surveys, but fax machines are typically going out of fashion. So, it is seen to be something which is lowering in usage, and it is faster with higher response rate, but it is only useful mostly for business service because typically most people don't keep a fax machine at home unless they have very, very specific utility for the same. And then there are drop-off surveys. These share the advantages and disadvantages of mail systems and have slightly higher costs and higher response rates because the drop-off requires the consumer to be willing and participative, and it can be useful for local market service. So, this is the other format which exists. Now, how do you improve response rates? Because the more your sample size, the deterministic value of your inputs is higher. It's closer to the final population that you are trying to project it on. So, you can give people prior notification that, hey, we are going to send a survey your way, please fill it out. Then if you incentivize them, there could be monetary incentives, you could pay them some money, or non-monetary incentives, like you could give them some sort of gamification. Benefits. So, in these ways you can actually give them certain benefits of needing to participate in that. In monetary, you can have prepaid or promised gratification coming in at their end. Gamification wise, you can put them on a leaderboard. You can give them exclusive benefits. You can make them part of your CRM benefits, give them a club experience, and a variety of other things. And then you can follow up to ensure that people actually have filled up surveys, and you can have other facilitators also take up the entire activity and ensure people fill surveys out. Yes, each of these add to the time required and the cost involved to ensure more and more people do fill out surveys. Now, beyond this, there are testing scenarios with quantitative research. Now, major experimental and causal research formats are discussed here. We've discussed this part, now we are on to the second one. In terms of experimental research, you need to understand that there are 2 points in a journey, and one is a cause, the other is the effect of said cause. This is the kind of connection between the 2 points that is tried to establish in the causal concepts. Now, in order to understand cause and effect, we need to understand how in ordinary meaning and scientific meaning these things differ. The scientific meaning becomes even more of importance because at the end of the day, it needs to have statistical significance, which is what the entire aim of doing descriptive or causal research is, because you need to get hard numbers, you need to get data points, which can then formulate a particular direction for you to perceive, in which how the data is flowing, you can understand. You can understand what to make of that data later on. So, X is the only cause of Y is the ordinary meaning, but in the scientific fact, it could be X is one of a number of possible causes of Y, but it is seen to be the only cause. X must always lead to Y. X is a deterministic cause of Y. And in the scientific way, it shows that the occurrence of X makes the occurrence of Y more probable. So, it is a probabilistic cause, whereas in ordinary meaning, it shows it as a deterministic cause. It determines the other. But here, the probability increases. Yes, you can have a number which defines how probable it is. And then in ordinary meaning, it is possible to prove that X is a cause of Y. Whereas scientifically, we can never prove that X is a cause of Y. At best, we can infer that X is a cause of Y, because there could be other factors which we haven't gauged, or which we haven't probed, or which we haven't tested for, which we haven't collected enough data and evidence for. So, scientific approaches always require you to seek more, better, wider. Typically, when we look at experimentation, it is used to infer causal relationships. Why do we look at these causal relationships? Is because causality requires some explanation. Scientific concept of causality is fairly complex. In scientific explanation terms, causality means something very different to what the average person in regular terms understands, and the scientist looks at these aspects more than any regular person. A statement such as X causes Y will have the following meaning to the ordinary person and to a scientist, which is what we have just discussed. And the scientific meaning of causality is more appropriate to marketing research because, again, statistical significance is important, and therefore the ordinary meaning is left a little away. We focus more on the scientific side of things. Marketing effects are caused by multiple variables. So, which is why we tend to try and keep it in the scientific space, and relationships are what we try and derive between the cause and effect. So, this relationship between cause and effect tends to be probabilistic. The higher the probability, the more it is the cause that is creating the effect. We can never prove causality, but we can demonstrate it conclusively with the higher end of probability coming into our favor to define the argument. We can infer a cause and effect relationship, therefore, and it is possible, therefore, that the true causal relation can be existed If it does, it may not have been identified, which is why we need to seek more, which is where we've spoken of that. And the concept of causality is something which you can further explore by discussing the conditions of the causality. So, you have to see whether you have looked at enough number of conditions, you have checked wide enough, and you have sought to solve that one thing is causing the other enough number of times with enough number of examples. So, these are things that you need to keep in mind when you're looking at causality. Now, what are the conditions for causality? Because this tends to get more statistics and mathematics driven. Before assuming causality, three conditions very importantly must be met. The concomitant variation, this refers to the correlation between the cause X and effect Y. So, for example, if you have better in-store service, it will give you higher sales. Now, this can't be exactly proven that this in-store service quality going up will prove that there will be higher sales, but the chances are that the hypothesis will hold. It supports that particular hypothesis, but it does not prove, like we spoke of, without controlling other factors, for example, the store size. If you have a large store size, definitely you will need more people servicing. If you have less people servicing, however good they may not be able to attend to all customers. There may be other factors like footfalls. There may be other factors like seasonality. So, a lot of factors can come into play when we are looking at something like higher sales, what has caused it. Then the time order of occurrence. This cause must occur before or simultaneously with the effect. So, they have to be packed very, very close together. This happened and the immediate next happening was the effect. So, the cause and effect are completely related. So, this brings it closer to prove that the hypothesis is right. An event cannot cause another that happens afterwards. So, in some cases, events may act as both causes and effects, which means they themselves trigger that kind of thought process in the consumer's mind, which causes that particular purchase decision. And you have to also constantly look at the absence of other causal factors. This identified factor must be the only explanation for the effect. So, you have to put control over other influencing factors, which is possible with experimental designs, which is why when you're looking at cause and effect scenarios, you're also doing multiple test and control scenarios, so that you experiment and find out whether truly this particular instance is the cause for an effect which you observed. Now, with evidence of concomitant variation, the time order of occurrence and the elimination of other factors, it doesn't still prove causality, but it proves strong and consistent evidence and can prove that there is a causal relationship. It may still not prove that 100% this is the exact cause, but therefore it proves that the causal relationship between cause and effect are increased. When you've got more and more evidence from multiple studies, it increases the confidence, which means the probability graph keeps going up. And when it is interpreted with deep conceptual knowledge of the issue, your confidence of getting a response from cause to effect is typically highlighted. Controlled experiments offer strong evidence that all three conditions of the causality are in effect. So, which is what we have to put into play. There is a test scenario where you're testing for some cause, whether it is causing the effect. You've wiped out the other outside factors which are causing the effect. Vis-a-vis, you've got a control scenario. And in the control scenario, what you're trying to do is you're trying to keep a normal occurrence and observing both parallelly. So, these sort of provide you with a benchmark where the control becomes the benchmark, and the test is how you actually map whether your hypothesis has worked out or not. So, let's try and understand experimentation in causality. We are in the space of conclusive research. Conclusive research is two ways. One is descriptive, which we have discussed in the previous segment, and then there is causal, which we are currently on. So, when we are probing causal experiments, the process of experimentation takes you either into a field experiment where you're going out there in the world, or you are doing it in a controlled environment where you're testing it inside of a laboratory. There are certain independent variables which you can manipulate, and there are certain extraneous variables which you can try and control. So, this is what forms your control and test scenarios which we just discussed. You control the extraneous variables so that the effect is minimized, while you can keep changing the independent variables for each particular iteration of the test you conclude and see which particular factor has actually been the cause for the effect you have observed. Once you see these, you find which particular causing variables are giving the effect. So, these dependent variables become the cause, and then you can actually measure statistically in test units how many times, to what degree, what probability. So, all these things, then you can start over multiple iterations of the experiment, you can start to observe these. So, let us understand these in detail. Field versus laboratory experiments. Field experiments measure behavior, attitudes, perceptions in natural settings, whereas laboratory experiments occur in artificial settings like advertising tests, typically the way research is done in field, or test kitchens where you have a certain space which is dedicated to such experiments. You call people who are respondents into that space and you run the entire experiment with them. Now, the key concepts in experimentation here are, there are certain independent variables like we spoke of. These are manipulated by the researcher to measure the effects of each particular independent variable. For example, in-store radio advertising. So, when you're walking into a store, if you hear over the public address radio, which is constantly playing inside the store environment, are you affected towards a purchase? And you can measure how many people. So, here you can see how many people put it into cart, how many people completed purchase, how many people spoke of the offer. I am sure when you put out the advertisement, you will want to test whether a certain offer that you put out is working, and you will also use that offer as a marker of your test module. So, you will use all these things and you will see whether the consumer asks for these particular things or showcases their behavior in a certain way. In terms of test units, you can look at individual people, you can look at stores or areas where the responses are studied, and dependent variables wise, you will see the effect of independent variables which are used in this particular sale. So, for example, store sales are dependent variables which get affected because of the independent variables being changed. Extraneous variables are other variables which are affecting responses, and at times they are confounding the results. For example, the store size, the location, the kind of footfalls we have. There could be other factors like day of week. It could also be factors like day part. Is it the prime shopping moment? Is it not in the entire day? Then there is random assignment. What randomly assignment does is it assigns test units to either experimental or control groups. The test is the experimental group, the control is the obvious opposite of it, to minimize extraneous effects. It randomly pushes people into either scenario and then tests the results of whatever you've been experimenting. In terms of experimental design, it is always a structured plan. So, you know exactly what you are testing for, who you are testing with. So you know your test units, you know whether they're independent or dependent variables, and how which particular extraneous factors are available in that scenario, and how you're controlling them. And Right Aid, a brand we've been seeing throughout this, randomly assigns stores to experimental and control groups and keeps checking on how certain stimuli are actually affecting the sales aspect of things. So, this is how the randomization aspect works in the entire experimental and causal scenarios. So, when we look at internal versus external validity in experiments, we look at these two aspects, where internal validity is whether if you're manipulating the independent variables or treatments, you're actually causing the observed effects on the dependent variables. And external validity wise, what you check for is whether the cause and effect relationships you have thought of in your hypothesis are found in the experiment, and whether they can be generalized over firstly the sample and then the population. So, you need to check for these progressions in terms of internal validity and external validity. So, internal validity, to be more precise, refers to whether the observed effects on the dependent variable are due to the manipulation of independent variables and not extraneous factors. You have to cancel out the effect of extraneous factors. It ensures that the experiment measures what it intends to measure, and there is no creeping error on the hypothesis which can throw your observation out of focus. Then there is external validity, where we are trying to check whether the findings can be generalized beyond the experimental setting to other populations, settings, timelines, etc. There is a certain amount of balancing in the validity act by using applied marketing research. In lab experiments, you improve the internal validity and you may reduce external validity due to the artificial settings. Now, in field experiments, you enhance the external validity, but you reduce the internal validity because your extraneous variables become uncontrolled completely. And how do you go about controlling these extraneous variables? You assign test units randomly to ensure that extraneous factors are evenly distributed amongst all the experiments that you're doing, and this improves the external validity as well. Randomization takes that particular bias or error away from the entire activity. Now, when you look at experimental designs, they can fall into these formats. So, there is pre-experimental design, where you can use a one-shot case study, you can one group pre-test, post-test formats, and then you can have a static group. In true experimental formats, you can have a pre-test, post-test control group and a post-test only control group. And then statistically, you can have a factorial design going into play. Let's understand these in a bit of detail. Now, what is a one-shot case study? You don't have any control group and it has no randomization. It has very weak internal validity, but this is suitable for exploratory research, where you're trying to probe and test that whether your hypothesis, even if it is holding water or not. This is typically done for pilots or POCs, which are proof of concepts. Now, then there is one group pre-test, post-test design. You measure a group before and after the treatment. So, O1 and X is the action and O2 is the other group. But this lacks a control group, therefore making the conclusions questionable due to uncontrolled variables which you may know or not know of. Then there is a static group design. Here it compares an experimental group EG with a control group CG, but lacks randomization, which can introduce extraneous variables into the entire mix. Now, true experimental designs are most complex, most detailed. They also include the randomization and offer more control over extraneous variables. Statistical designs use statistical methods to control and analyze extraneous variables and their effect also. When you look at statistical designs in experiments, you need to understand that you're involving multiple basic experiments which are running simultaneously, and this allows for statistical control and analysis of external variables. How do you do this? The advantages that it gives you is the effects of multiple independent variables are actually studied and they are factored in, and you statistically control specific extraneous variables which you can calibrate up or down. And in terms of factorial design, you use the measure of effects of two or more independent variables at different levels, and you allow for interaction measurement. So basically what you do is, if you've got a grid and on one side you've got variables 1, 2, 3, and on the other side you've got A, B, C, you see the recording of their interactions in each of these places, and with that you get the observation of the entire table of interactions. Once you've done the interaction measurement, the combined effect of variables differs from their individual effects. When you represent it as a table with cells, every possible combination of treatment variables exists, and so you can see which one has really worked in your favor. Now, while you are doing all of these things in quantitative research, you have to ensure that your data does not go all over the place. Your data has to be precise, it has to be recorded well, and it has to be, after recording, handled properly. So, data sufficiency becomes a very big question when it comes to the entire act of quantitative research. Quantitative begins with data, and so hence data is key. It is primary to the existence and efficacy of any quantitative format. Here we are looking at measurement and scaling, which is the last part of the entire quantitative journey, because measurement is where you're finally putting numbers and value to a certain kind of data, and scaling is a method by which you can take things which are otherwise open-ended statements, but you give them a rating point basis which you can put specific definitive numbers and gauge them for their propensity to make it ring true with the consumer or put it something away from the consumer's mind. Let's get into measurement first. So, you assign, like we spoke of, numbers or symbols that characterize the objects based on certain amount of rules. You can define the rules yourself, but by putting numbers or symbols, you are giving them a certain value, and that value is something you can test over your entire process of measurement. It measures characteristics like perceptions, attitudes, and preferences, but does not measure the object itself. What is the purpose? Obviously, when you've got numbers and tabulation involved, you go towards statistical analysis at the end of it. And it also facilitates the communication of what results you got and under which particular rules you got that particular result. So, the moment the rules, let's say, if they are the variables that you can change in a test scenario, you will observe that the results are the output. So, this is the cause and this is the effect of that particular change. So, you can actually test these out for causal effects as well. Here the key aspect is there is one-to-one correspondence between the numbers and their characteristics. So, each number will showcase a certain kind of characteristic, and you can apply rules uniformly across objects and time. At any instance, the same thing will occur and it will be replicative of what happened at certain other instances and across objects. Now, how does scaling help? It helps you extend the measurement and creates a continuum to locate measured objects. So, if you've got a timeline and if there is a certain pattern which you can observe in that particular timeline, then scaling actually allows you to look at it further down the line. and actually helps you measure where it could be by means of projection. Now, rating attitudes towards fast food restaurants on a scale of 1 to 3. This can be measured over time, measured across customers, and it typically gives you a certain understanding of where the likelihood of people reviewing that particular restaurant will fall in a particular point in time in the future. Also, the process for this assigns numbers to individual responses and then places respondents on a continuum based on a total score. So, they've got various questions you can ask which form the entire gamut of a particular thing you're probing, and with the total score, you're able to see exactly how well the brand is doing or how poorly it is. Now, there are various scales of measurement, which is from the low to the high end. The low end is a nominal scale, then you go on to an ordinal scale, then you go on to an interval scale, and finally go on to a ratio scale. How is this different? Let's try and understand through certain examples. So, when we look at a nominal scale, you can have numbers assigned to runners in a certain race. So, who came in at which particular position at the finish line can be seen, and you can understand who came in at what particular position by the numbers they have been assigned to where. Runner number 7 came in first, runner number 7 came in third, runner number 8 came in second, and runner number 3 came in first place. This is how you will define it. Then there is ordinal. So, this basically defines the hierarchy and it ranks the order of winners. There is a third place winner, there is a second place winner, and there is obviously a first place winner. Then, in terms of intervals, you can understand the gaps between each. So, when you're ensuring that your performance rating on a 1 to 10 scale, the third place winner will get a rating of 8.2, second place winner will get a rating of 9.1, first place gets 9.6, and these can be rating points which are then provided for each particular observation. And then ratio, how fast was one compared to the other. This is the highest kind of scale. So, say one person finished the race who came third in 15.2 seconds. The person who came in second got 14.1 seconds, and the winner finished it in just 13.4 seconds. So, this is how you got a ratio of the speeds of the individuals and can actually look at how each of their performances have stacked up vis-a-vis the other. Now, when we look at these particular examples, you will notice that there are certain basic characteristics, some examples which we can take of these, and how you can apply them in marketing. So, basic characteristics of nominal scales will typically be numbers, and they will identify and classify objects. Some common examples of these are social security numbers. These are fixed numbers, they don't change. Or the numbers on jerseys of players. In marketing examples, these can be brand numbers. These could be store types or the classification by a particular gender. In ordinal numbers, you notice numbers indicate the relative positions of the objects, but not the magnitude of differences between them. You just look at the order in which they have been placed. So, quality rankings wise, where do you stand in the entire rankings? And rankings of teams in tournament are examples of ordinal numbers. Here, you will see there is a certain preference in a brand survey where consumers have expressed their interest in a certain brand. So, the preference gives you a ranking, your market position also gives you a ranking, and it also shows who you are as a consumer if you are looking at a social class, whether you're below poverty line, you're mid income, you're high income, you're super high income. There are various ways to classify you, but it does not show you by how much. Then you've got an interval ranking. So, this is another scale where differences between the objects can be compared. How much gap is there? 0 point is an arbitrary point in this case. Temperatures, for example, in the Fahrenheit or Celsius scales are examples of interval scales. Again, in marketing, what kind of attitudes have you shown? And how different is your attitude from mine or the person next door? their opinions, how are they different, what kind of implications do these opinions have, and certain index numbers which showcase how we are different from each other. And finally, the ratio, which is the degree. The 0 point is fixed. The ratios of scale values can be computed. So this shows you things like length, weight. In the case of marketing, age, income, costs, sales, market share. These are comparative figures which showcase one vis-a-vis the other item. Now, in terms of scale types, let's look at nominal scale types. This is a labeling scheme where numbers serve as labels or tags and help in identifying or classifying objects. Numbers are only for identification and there is strict one-to-one correspondence between numbers and objects. So, each object will be one particular number. Now, numbers can be also used to classify objects into mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive categories. So, this is something where you are plotting a code for one particular denomination. So, male is 1, female is 2. That way, you can code each of these. Now, then key points could be numbers don't reflect the amount or superiority of a particular characteristic. They are just used to define the count of one particular characteristic. And in a fast food study, restaurant numbers 1 to 5 don't imply ranking, they just identify which restaurant it is. And the lowest level of measurement in scales is the nominal kind of scale. Then you have the ordinal scale where you have the sequence in which they have appeared in that particular scenario. It is a ranking scale. Numbers indicate the relative extent to which objects possess a characteristic. So, it is comparison to relative position, more or less. So, if you've got more, you're higher. If you've got less, you're lower in the pecking order. And this showcases not the magnitude of differences, but it shows things like quality rankings, tournament results, who came first, who came second, who came third. Socio-economic class, so you've got socio-economic classification A, B, C, D and so on and so forth. Then you've got preferences, yes, no. And then in terms of ranking in fast food restaurants based on preference, 1 is being most preferred and 5 is least preferred. This shows how much the restaurant is ranked by its consumers. Differences in rank, for example, Pizza Hut ranked first, McDonald's ranked 2 are known, but the degree of preference difference is not. So, by how much is Pizza Hut a more preferable brand compared to McDonald's is unclear from this data. Then, in terms of transformation, ordinal scales can be transformed while maintaining the order. So, basically 1, 2, 3 can be changed to 10, 25, 30 because you are still keeping that particular ranking in place. Interval wise, you can showcase the distances between scale values and these showcase equal differences in the characteristics being measured. Each will have a plotting point on that particular scale. That is how you will put information on an ordinal scale and allow comparison of differences. So, constant or equal intervals between scale values. So, difference between 1 to 2 is same as 2 to 3, 5 to 6. This is the kind of defined scaled intervals and you will have to plot where each of the instances occur. So, temperature scale is one example. So, if you've got a 5-point scale measuring attitudes, I like Starbucks coffee, from 1 strongly disagree to 5 strongly agree. These could be a range of scales you are responding to in a survey. So, all of these scale usages are finally ending up in questions and the methodology in measuring the answers on the question when you're putting out surveys. 0 point is arbitrary and not fixed. Ratios are not meaningful because a ranking of 6 does not mean twice as much as a rating of 3. It's just a sequential ranking. Here, scale values can be shifted by adding a constant. For example, shifting 1 to 7 scale to 11 to 17 scale, you can scale the values also. In terms of ratio, this provides all the properties of nominal, ordinal and interval scales and therefore has to have a fixed absolute 0 point. From that, when you have a fixed absolute 0 point, you can measure anything going in particular direction. This can identify all things, identify the particular item, identify its rank and compare their status compared to each other. These ratios are meaningful. For example, 14 is 7 times as large as 2. So it gives a ratio, but how many times is it larger than 2? And you can measure various things like height, weight, age, income, sales, market share, number of customers. A variety of such characteristics can be measured. And in marketing, for example, annual dollar amount spent at fast food restaurants, you can see $50 at McDonald's versus $10 at Burger King. So you can understand people have spent 5x of what they would have spent at Burger King at a McDonald's. Here, proportionate transformations only can occur, which is by multiplying by a constant. These are not as popular as interval scales due to difficulty of respondents providing ratio scale data, and fixed point is 0, which 0 means no spending. So you have to start with absolute 0 and go ahead in the scale. Now, comparative and non-comparative scales, here you will see scaling techniques move into two formats. One side is the comparative scales, where objects are evaluated relative to other objectives. So you can have paired comparisons, you can have a rank order, you can have a constant sum. And on the non-comparative side, you will have objects that are evaluated independently. Now, here in comparative scales, you involve direct comparison of two or more objects. So you can showcase how one is standing vis-a-vis the other. And you put an ordinal or rank order comparison in this case. So you have paired comparisons, rank order, constant sum as examples, and is also known as non-metric scaling or ordinal data, and non-comparative scales where you've got monadic or metric data. Objects are evaluated independently. Data typically assumed to be at an interval or ratio level is scaled. Examples for this are Likert scale, semantic differential, Stapel scale, and also known as metric scaling. So, for example, if I give you rate this particular service from 1 to 5, where 1 is the least that you would give it and 5 is the highest. This is typically your Likert scale. Stapel scale typically works like this, where you've got a mid 0 point and a +5 and a -5 rating, and you can have intervals in the middle. So again, it is like giving it a certain rank in that particular ordinal fashion. Now, itemized rating scales here, if you see, are Likert, semantic differential, and Stapel, which we just discussed. And in terms of measuring, you can see in the scale, there's continuous rating scale. Basic characteristics placed on a continuous line. Examples are reaction to TV commercials. How do you respond to a TV commercial? And advantages are these are easy to construct and easy for people to respond to. And scoring can be cumbersome unless computerized. So this is the only disadvantage. Where in terms of itemized rating scale, you can have a degree of agreement on a 1 strongly disagree to a 5 strongly agree scale. This measurement of attitudes could be there. Easy to construct, administer and understand is the advantage, but it is slightly time consuming as well. In semantic differential, 7-point scale with bipolar labels. So you have brand, product and company images on both sides. This is very versatile because you can put two different points on each side of that particular scale. But it is difficult to construct bipolar adjectives. One must mean the exact opposite of the other. Stapel scale has a unipolar 10-point scale, -5 to +5, without a neutral point or 0. Measurement of attitudes and images, easy to construct and administer over telephone, and confusing and difficult to apply is where the challenge comes in, because it tends to become fairly long, -5 to +5. So it's a fairly large range. Now, in marketing research, we have gone through a variety of things which we have probed, and quantitative research helps you put all these things down in very, very measurable data-led formats, so that you are able to not only inspect what is going on, you are able to run it through surveys, you are able to observe certain things that are happening out there. And when you're recording instances, when you're recording responses, when you're getting feedback from customers, you're able to help them put something which is abstract in something which is measurable form. That is what we saw in the scaling aspect. So, therefore, in marketing research, it's essential to choose the right methodology. This is extremely important, and that is what will give you the valuable insights. When you're trying to use a sampling aspect, you have to use a small portion of the entire audience, but once you've done it for that particular sample, when you project it back to the larger population, you're able to see that the effects stand its ground when it comes to the larger population as well. Descriptive research helps us understand the characteristics, behaviors, and trends, and it uses techniques like surveys. We've discussed surveys, we've discussed observations, and both these things help people describe certain things in a specific form by form, factor by factor way. Causal research goes further than just descriptive research, and it tests. So, it has cause and effect relationships, and it is often through experiments which we have noticed. So, one thing leading to the other, we have noticed how they can be put in control and test scenarios. Randomization helps keep the external variables at bay, and when we look first, we look for internal validity and then check for external validity to ensure it holds water both in lab as well as field assignments. Then quantitative research methods including experimental designs like pre-experimental, true experimental and statistical designs enable us to control the variables and measure the impact of treatments or interventions. Within this framework, scaling techniques, we've just completed scaling techniques of a variety, and these are used to quantify data in the nominal, ordinal, interval and ratio. These are the four formats in which we look at scaling and understanding how we look at data points when taking responses from consumers. Comparative scales such as comparisons and rank order evaluate objects in relation to each other, producing ordinal data, the ranking aspect of things. Non-comparative scales like Likert and semantic differential scales assess objects independently and often result in interval or ratio data and help the researchers get more detailed analysis and informed decision making, because first you're doing it on the sample and then you're applying it on the population. So, this is basically the larger progress path when you're using a data based assessment system. So, with that, we come to the end of today's conversation. Next time around, we will jump back into market forces and discuss VUCA factors and how they impact market forces at a larger extent. And until then, I thank you for being such a wonderful audience. I'll see you next time.